Good evening. My name's Regina Hill. I'm a member of the PEN Melbourne Committee. As many of you may know, PEN Melbourne's part of a federation of organisations that work to promote writing, to protect freedom of speech, and to advocate for writers who have been killed, harmed, are under threat or in detention as a result of their work. It's a sad state of affairs that today, at any given point in time, there might be up to 1,000 writers who are in that situation. And tonight, obviously, we're going to talk about two cases in particular, that of Peter Greste and Alan Morison and their colleagues. We want to use this discussion, though, to go further than that and ask some questions about the implications of those cases in relation to freedom of speech and the importance of a critical media. PEN Melbourne's very grateful to be able to hold this session tonight in collaboration with the Wheeler Centre and with the nonfictionLab from RMIT University. We'll run the session in very much a standard Wheeler Centre format, so we'll start by having a discussion for about 40 minutes with my colleagues on the stage, and then we'll turn to you for your comments, observations and questions, and try and end up right on 7:15 p.m. So I'd like to start then by introducing my colleagues on the stage. So on my immediate left is Cece Ojany. Cece's a fellow member of the PEN Melbourne Committee. She's a writer in her own right, and since 2012 she's been the PEN Melbourne's Writers in Prison officer. So she's uniquely placed to give us an indication and an understanding of the cases that have been brought against Peter Greste and Alan Morison, but also to help us understand some of the context in which those cases sit. Next to Cece is Mark Baker. Mark is an experienced journalist and editor. He has worked as a foreign correspondent in Asia. He's reported on the Afghanistan and Iraq war and was actually injured when reporting on the civil war in Bougainville in the 1990s. He's also served as the political editor and the Canberra desk chief for The Age. He's currently the chief executive officer of the Melbourne Press Club, and so obviously has a wealth of knowledge to share with us in terms of the challenges that journalists can face when they're working overseas. And finally, Alex Wake is also an experienced journalist. She has experience working in Australia and overseas. She is currently a lecturer with the nonfictionLab at RMIT University, and she has a special interest in the journalism education, and so again is well positioned to provide us with a different perspective in terms of the responsibilities of the media and how journalists operate when they're caught in difficult situations. You'll notice that we also have an empty chair. The empty chair is a tradition for PEN organisations. It's used to reflect writers who are not able to participate in these events because of the circumstances that they find themselves in as a result of their work. And tonight it's appropriate, I think, that we recognise that that chair represents Peter Greste, Alan Morison and their colleagues. Can I ask you to welcome our panel? So Cece, I might start with you and ask you to give us an overview of the cases that are currently against Peter Greste and Alan Morison, so we can all start on the same page in terms of understanding the situation they're in.
Thank you, Regina. So Peter Greste and two of his colleagues, Mohammed Fahmy and Bahir Mohammed, were arrested on December 29th, 2013. They were accused of, among other things, trying to tarnish the reputation of the Egyptian government by spreading false information. And Mohammed and Bahir were charged with the more serious crime of belonging to a terrorist organization, in this case the Muslim Brotherhood. There are a few important things to note about the Peter Greste case. Peter Greste is actually not based in Cairo. He's actually based in Kenya. So he's the Al Jazeera reporter for East African News, and he was in Cairo for just 2 weeks relieving a colleague. That's how he ended up there. The Muslim Brotherhood had only just been declared a terrorist organization very shortly before Peter and his colleagues were arrested. Prior to that, they were a legitimate political party, just to put things into context. And one of their members, Mohamed Morsi, was actually elected the president in 2012. He was deposed by the military in 2013, in July, and it was thereafter that the Brotherhood was declared a terrorist organization. And this is how Peter Greste and his colleagues have gotten caught up in this situation. It's also valuable for everybody here to know that Peter Greste is an award-winning journalist. He won the Peabody Award in 2011 for a documentary he produced for the BBC about Somalia. And in his acceptance speech, he said that he was dedicating the award to all the media professionals who have paid the ultimate sacrifice, in Somalia in that case, not in pursuit of wealth and glory, but for the fundamental journalistic principle of bearing witness. The case of Alan Morison is unfolding in Thailand. Penn Melbourne was told about Alan Morison's case by a former colleague of his from The Age. Alan has been based in Thailand, in Phuket, for very many years now. He's the editor of the English language website Phuket1.com. And together with a Thai colleague of his, a lady called Chutima Siddhasatyan, they've been charged by the Royal Thai Navy of criminal defamation and breach of Thailand's Computer Crimes Act. So what Alan and his colleague did was they actually published an article on their website about the Rohingya Muslim people. These are a group of boat people who have been fleeing Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. They've been fleeing persecution in Myanmar, and Alan has been reporting on that story for a very long time. What's interesting about Alan Morison's case, though, is the passage that the Royal Thai Navy has a problem with does not actually include Alan's words per se. He got that excerpt from a Reuters report on this Rohingya Muslim people issue. So that was one of his defenses, that it's an excerpt he got from a Reuters report. Reuters has stood by their story, and in fact in April of this year, that story won the Pulitzer Prize for International Journalism. So this is what's happening with Alan Morison. They're currently in mediation talks with the Royal Thai Navy, but that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And it looks like they'll be going to trial in March of next year. And if they're found guilty, they face up to 7 years in prison. So that's the situation with both those stories.
And they're not uncommon cases?
No, they're not uncommon. Penn Melbourne does a lot of work concerning writers around the world who are persecuted for their writing. And in Egypt, since Mohamed Morsi was deposed in July last year, there have been numerous arrests. The number has been said to be as high as 21,000 people being arrested because of a series of, protests, anti-Morsi, pro-Morsi, anti-Muslim Brotherhood, pro-Muslim Brotherhood, skirmishes with the police, that sort of thing. Yeah.
So the comment that Peter made when he accepted his award, that he was bearing witness, is similar, I guess, in many respects to some of the information that's come out in his open letters, where he's commented on the fact that he's been detained in effect for doing what any responsible journalist would, to record, present and try to make sense of events as they unfold. Obviously that's challenging when you're working in a place where it's so politically charged as Egypt. Mark, in terms of your experience as a journalist, are those sorts of challenges things that you actively take into consideration as you approach your work? And if so, how do you deal with them?
Well, it's a constant issue, and I'd say in particular about these not so much the Morison case in Thailand, but particularly Greste's case, is I think it demonstrates absolutely how more risky and unpredictable the environment can be now for journalists in different parts of the world. And even if you approach your assignments in a knowledgeable and cautious way, in terms of political risk, you can never kind of predict things. I would expect that Peter Greste had no sense of this coming at all before it landed. So, and he's a particularly savvy guy, Peter. I've worked with him in Afghanistan. He's an exceptional journalist, which that Peabody Award demonstrates. He's as straight as a die, and clearly, demonstrably, the case against him is preposterous. No skerrick of evidence was produced to suggest that he had any affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood at all. So it's...
I'm going to butt in because I'm a bit rude like that.
Yeah.
I think he did know the risks, and I'm so sorry that he is in jail, and it's a dreadful place for anyone to be. But Al Jazeera had been kicked out of Egypt. Al Jazeera Arabic was gone. Al Jazeera English had been operating in what they call in black for some time, and basically they hadn't been putting their staff on TV, so you didn't actually know who they were. They'd only just decided to go back to showing their faces again. Peter was there on a 2-week secondment, Christmas leave. He'd been in Africa and the Middle East for long enough to have known the risks.
Oh, look, I'm not saying that he went in there in an ignorant way. He would have absolutely known all of that. But I think what I was trying to say, I suppose, is that to expect the outcome that's come from this, which is, breathtaking, I don't think... I mean, he might have expected perhaps they're going to boot me out, or which is, the most common form, and journalists, well, okay, do it. But to be locked up and to be imprisoned for 6 months and then get this sentence, I think he wouldn't have had any expectation of that. I mean, if he did had, I'm sure he wouldn't have gone.
I think he might have said that to his parents. But certainly the situation there has been deteriorating, and the situation for journalists around the world has been deteriorating. Between 2011 and 2012, the number of journalists that have been killed increased by 43% for just doing their job. And one of those, and actually most of those are actually in Mexico, and that's around crime and drugs. But whenever we send these brave people in from news organisations, I think that news organisations have to really sit there and consider, are we thinking about those people? We've had rapes in Egypt, now we've got jailings. We need to think, how can we be best placed to actually cover those stories? Is it by throwing in people that don't know the situation, don't speak the language, or should we be relying more on local journalists?
Although in the case of Al Jazeera English, a number of the journalists that they have there are actually Egyptian, either by birth or have spent a lot of time resident in Egypt. So, and they are also facing similar sorts of challenges. So...
Well, indeed, I think as a general point, the use of local journalists, and there's no doubt, in major conflict, the big international organisations and networks, and particularly the television people, they use locals, they use local people because they can get around, and these people are in exceptionally dangerous circumstances because they're out there without any protection of, for what it's worth, a strong Western government at home sort of speaking up for them. They're in a very perilous situation, and as we well know, many of them have died as a consequence of that.
In his, Peter has written a few letters that have since been smuggled out of Tora prison, and in one of those letters he asked a very pertinent question where he points out that, if a political party or an organisation like the Muslim Brotherhood is declared a terrorist organisation, where does that leave reporters? He asked the question, how are you supposed to report in a balanced, fair and accurate way if you're not allowed to talk to or about the major players? And that's a valid question, as I said earlier, the Muslim Brotherhood was a political party. It was declared a terrorist organisation shortly before they were arrested.
So when you're doing your education training with journalists, Alex, what discussions do you have about how to work through this conundrum? The issue of saying I need to stay true to the journalistic ethic, but I need to consider the context in which I'm working.
We talk about bearing witness, we talk about truth-telling, pointing a light in dark corners. But the other thing I specialise in teaching is talking about the particular countries that people are going into and studying that and understanding that before they go in. Having lived and worked in the Middle East for 3 years, I don't say for one moment that I understand that part of the world, but I have an inkling of that part of the world. It was a great shock to me when I got to the Middle East to discover that the understanding of a journalist there was not the understanding of a journalist I have from my work here. A journalist in the Middle East is often seen as an activist. And I think you might all remember the shoe being thrown at George Bush. And that wasn't a shock to the Arabic journalists, it was a shock to Western journalists. There was a different understanding of what journalism is in some parts of the world. And if you go into somewhere like Egypt not understanding that Al Jazeera is not well liked in the Middle East, if you are a member of Al Jazeera staff, you will find yourself being targeted in a way other news organisations aren't targeted, even though it may be filled with former BBC and ABC employees. It still has Al Jazeera as its tag, and they are therefore a target.
And so when you're thinking about that and the need to understand the local context, what do you think the implications are then if you have journalists in those locations, foreign journalists who are put in the situations that Peter Greste is? What does that say to foreign journalists who may come in even with that understanding? What are the implications in terms of what they can and can't do?
Well, Mark can obviously talk about the practical implications of this, but they have to be incredibly brave. And the reason that Peter was in there was that he doesn't have a family, that he can take those risks because he's not worried about people at home. Well, obviously his parents are also.
Well, I think there's also obviously another dimension to that, in that he's a full-time staff member of Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is his boss, they say, and his job is he's based in Kenya, but he roves, and they tell you to go somewhere, you go there, and in an ideal world you'd say, well, hang on, I want to weigh the pros and cons of doing this, but if the call comes to go, you need to go, and that's that. I think one of the disturbing things that's come out of this, and I think it's both true of the Greste case and Morison and Phuket One, is the extent to which news organisations stand behind their employees, and as we know, there's pretty ample evidence that in this case Al Jazeera has been perhaps more interested in playing politics than acting in the best interests of its employees. Its decision to proceed with the legal action to sue the Egyptian government over the confiscation of their assets was an outrageous thing to do in the context of their staff sitting in jail facing the sort of outcome that they've got. That would have undoubtedly made their position much worse. And I think that was an unforgivable act on the part of Al Jazeera. In the case of Thailand, as has been mentioned, what led to these defamation proceedings against those guys was republishing or publishing and indeed only part of this Reuters report, and yet Reuters, to their shame, has done little to sort of stand up. They've defended their report, but they haven't spoken out in defence of the people who published their journalism. They've been happy to pocket their Pulitzer Prize. And the other point about the awarding of that prize is that Chutima, Alan Morison's colleague, who's a very terrific journalist and who is a real expert on the Rohingya situation and the crisis that exists in Thailand, she worked as a fixer for Reuters in their reporting, which won the prize. And so she was this frontline local journalist who did the hard yards, opened her contact book, provided access to these key people that made that possible, and delivered this great and was a key player in delivering this outcome for Reuters. And yet Reuters has kind of, I think, largely washed its hands of this case.
And interestingly, there's been no action taken against Reuters. So they've gone after this little guy, newspaper, but not Reuters.
Yeah, well, clearly the calculations from Reuters' point of view were if they picked a fight with the Thai authorities, then that would jeopardise their massively valuable, business enterprise in Thailand. But I suppose on the other side of the coin is that I think the fact that they have sort of gone softly on it has perhaps created the environment where this mediation is possible, and the mediation does provide the possibility that there could be a negotiated settlement. I've been told, and I'm not sure how authoritative it is, but that as part of this, the Navy has indicated that it would seem in this context that the that the military commanders now running Thailand don't really have an appetite for this fight, and that's sort of filtered down to whoever it was within the Navy who's pursued this. So they're kind of looking for a deal, but in that context they want a form of apology from Morison, and my understanding is he's sort of reluctant to give that at this point. So, but anyway, there's an environment in which it could be sort of settled, and to the extent that Reuters hasn't pulled on a fight about this might make that more likely. But on what at what cost that might involve, we don't know.
So there's obviously a role for the employing media organisations. Is there a broader role for media organisations even outside those employers?
Sorry, if I could just finish off on the point. I didn't finish the point I was building up to there, is that I think certainly in my experience working as a correspondent, and I think it's been accepted by Western journalists at least generally, is that you can rely on your bosses to kind of stick with you through thick and thin, and if things get really tough then they'll spend whatever it takes and to give you the support that you need. And I say in both these cases, as I've described, suddenly there's another danger factor for journalists at the front line, and that is, yes, it is a more dangerous environment in which you're reporting. It's made more perilous by the fact that can you necessarily rely on your employer to help you out of a fix when you get in one?
And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that Al Jazeera is not a Western news outlet. It is a Qatari-based news organisation that has a lot of people who don't like it.
Yeah.
And to that extent, clearly a big element in this is that Qatar is a strong supporter of, is outraged that the election was overturned, and they're great supporters of Morsi, and that's just made the whole thing far more complicated. So it's deeply political. Yeah.
So as a sector then generally, does the media have a role beyond the employing organisations to take a stand in these types of cases in order to protect the capacity of journalists to play the role of critical media and to bear witness?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so proud of so many of our Australian news organisations that we are actually finally running the Greste story and not so much the Morison story. I know Greste's family had complained that no one was initially paying much attention, and they started a sort of social media campaign and started contacting local journalists and academics saying, please, can you do something? The media here is concerned, and certainly trying to keep pressure on our own government to do something about it. There's not a lot we can do at the bottom of the world, but if we keep telling Julie Bishop about it...
that should fix it.
That should fix it.
The role of governments, what do you think that is in this context? Cece, do you have a view?
Well, I think it's... I was born and raised in Kenya, and I've been in Australia now for 14 years, and it's interesting to compare how different people approach the news and how the news is presented depending on which country you come from. I think it's very telling that a story like the Schapelle Corby case has, more media coverage, and the average Australian knows more about a story like that than they do about a story like Peter Greste's or Alan Morison's. I think it's important for the media to keep talking about these things, and you hear the argument that it's too hard, it's too complicated, Egypt seems to be this faraway country, and do people even know what Al Jazeera is? But I've heard that too hard argument too many times. How simple does a story have to be for it to be easily digestible, for you to be interested in it? The world is so small nowadays that you can't really pretend to ignore what's happening in other parts of the world. So I do think the media has a role to keep talking about these stories, and if they need to make it more easily digestible, then they need to do that so that the average Australian knows about such cases.
I was talking to a colleague, Colleen Murrell at Deakin University, and she's writing a book which is out next year on fixers, which are the local journalists who help. And she was reminding me about the Beirut Hostages, the journalists who were taken hostage in the mid-80s. And there was great campaigns around them that journalists just kept on going, kept on raising it, kept on remembering it, and had to become activists to make sure that those journalists who were being held hostage weren't forgotten. And I was rereading some of that stuff last night, and I was thinking, I hope that it's not 7 years that we are having to remember this every month, every 6 months, every year. We need Greste out now. And I wonder what we need to do as Australians, as journalists, as academics, as writers to get Greste out, and what pressure we do need to bear.
And it's not just, in this digital age, it's not just journalists that are being persecuted for their work. A lot of the cases that PEN Melbourne deals with concern bloggers, poets, average Joes and Janes who are just tweeting and Facebooking and you know, creating poetry that's calling for social justice. So it's people like us here in this room who are being persecuted, arrested and killed in certain parts of the world. So it's important also to realise that.
So does that say that as Australians we're just less interested in international affairs, or that we don't appreciate the importance of freedom of speech because we take it for granted?
I'm writing a thesis on that at the moment, and I think we do take it for granted, and I don't think we have a very good understanding of it. But I'll let Mark answer that one.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I do think there's in terms of maintaining the pressure, as it were, maintaining interest, it's kind of hard from a news perspective to keep, unless there are developments, it's very hard to keep talking about it in a media context, because people say, oh, it's a natural reaction, what's new? Yeah, this guy's in jail, well, you know, what's changed? In terms of the lack of, to the extent that, clearly the Greste case is getting plenty of attention now. It didn't get as much earlier on. The Morison case hasn't had much either. I think in terms of the judgment of the media itself in handling these stories is to say, well, in the case of Greste, well, yes, he's been arrested, that's outrageous, but surely he'll get out. There's another hearing, and when and there's a delay because the trial process hasn't concluded, and when it gets to conclusion, well, surely we all see it so preposterous he can't possibly be jailed, and then bang, he does get jailed, so everybody's outraged. But I suppose in the case of Morison too, yes, there are developments, but we're now looking at another year before it goes to court. If it does go to court, there's mediation underway. It may be resolved, it may well be resolved. So, I think it needs the point, as in the case of Greste, where bang, this guy he's got this outrageous sentence, then you go to the barricades in a serious way at that point. But it's a little bit harder, I think, to generate that level of engagement around the Thai case, even though on its merits what's going on is fundamentally wrong, and unjustified.
Morison will only get headlines once he's jailed, if he's jailed.
Yeah.
Until then, he's a middle-aged man in Thailand. Yeah. And however important the story might be to academics and journalists, no one's really going to care about it until that happens.
So does that say that there is a role for social activism beyond the media then, in terms of actually working to advocate for these individuals in cases, and to do that both in the context of cases themselves, but also the context of the importance of freedom of speech, and having the ability to have a critical media that can then shine a light in places where we otherwise perhaps wouldn't look?
I think we need to rely more on civil society, on groups like PEN, on lawyers and human rights groups and NGOs who can speak out. I mean, you can't lay it all at the journalists to do something about it. Yeah. I mean, we'll help, but, with the media can't do everything.
So what are the sorts of things that PEN is doing with the writers in prison that it's working with?
So for if there's anyone in the room that doesn't know, Melbourne PEN is part of PEN International, and we value writing, freedom of expression, and in particular advocating for writers around the world who are persecuted for their writing. So my role as the Writers in Prison officer involves collating a whole bunch of information that is sent to the different PEN centres around the world from PEN International in London. And this information lets us know about a writer around the world who's either been detained or killed or is generally being persecuted for his or her job. We then put that information together in a one-pager and send it out to embassies and offices of the president and offices of the prime ministers here in Australia, but also overseas. So there are about 145 PEN centres around the world. So at any given time, an embassy will receive hundreds of letters from different PEN centres about a particular writer. There's a Turkish writer called Murahem Erbe, who was recently released. And one of the things he was grateful for was all the letters that he received from PEN members around the world, from as far as Cameroon, encouraging him and urging him to, keep the faith and keep his head up and all that kind of thing. So these sorts of things, activities are important. I also think the wariness that people have stems from absorbing all this information but not actually doing anything. When you keep reading about the horrible things that are happening in the world but you're not actually doing anything about it, even in a very small way, you become wary. You start feeling helpless. And this is something that people like Noam Chomsky have talked about. Noam Chomsky has said that the difference he sees in developed countries versus developing countries is a lot of people in developed countries feel helpless. Which is not actually true. You're not helpless. You have access to more resources, arguably, than a lot of people in developing countries. So it's about doing something, whether it's joining an organization like PEN and sending your letters to embassies and consulates and things like that, or having a protest at Federation Square, just so that, again, these stories don't remain hidden, because that's the worst thing that can happen to these journalists and writers and bloggers, for people not to know what's going on with them.
I think it's Nelson Mandela Day too, and he talks about the power of one, doesn't he?
Yeah,
so
it's his birthday today.
One letter.
Yes. I think, if we look at Peter Greste's father, he's asked people to continue to talk about and to try and maintain focus on his son's case as a way of being able to keep it in the eye of the press and keep a focus on change.
I think as well, Regina, there's also the human aspect of these stories. I actually prefer to refer to Peter Greste as Peter. I say Peter, so that I can remember that this is a human being. There's no difference between him and any of the men in this room. He's someone's son, he's someone's brother, he's someone's cousin. If you see these cases, Alan Morison and Peter Greste, as these far-away, nebulous stories that don't really have anything to do with you, that takes away the human element. And it's really important to bring these issues back down to the humanity of them. That's a human being. That's an Australian. I think he was born in Sydney.
Yeah, and he
languishing in a prison in Egypt.
Yeah. He went to QUT and was 2 years ahead of me.
Yeah.
So he's a real human being.
Yeah, he's a real human being.
Yeah.
So if you can join with me and thank our panel members, Cece, Mark and Alex, for their time.